Original sins 1. One of the original sins of belief, which negates freedom. Part 18 on human confusion. Original sins 1 of belief, faith negates freedom. Part 18 of the theme of the Oriental philosophers' analysis of contemporary human confusion. In the last lecture, we raised the topic of the original sin and lessons of faith, so we raised this topic based on a terrible fact covered with historical blood rust, that is, the religious spirit of the West has a common spiritual gene. Specifically, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, these three sacred beliefs, are all advocating a high moral standard of life, and from different perspectives, they are also calling for fraternity among human beings. But it is the three religions, the three sacred beliefs, the vendetta between them, which has lasted for thousands of years, that have become a tragic phenomenon in the whole history of mankind. It is based on such a fact that we propose the original sin of faith and the lesson of the subject. And the purpose that we put forward this topic is that now human beings are in the extremely difficult time of materialization. In the crisis of materialization, human beings are also in the difficult time of rebuilding spiritual beliefs. Then, we now put forward the original sin and lessons of past beliefs, to avoid the samsara of original sin and lessons of beliefs in the process of rebuilding spiritual homeland. So, what is the original sin of the past existing belief? In a word, the original sin of belief in the gene of the religious belief produced by the ancient Jewish wisdom. This original sin of belief, I call it, in the name of predestination, in the name of absolute truth, in the name of God's will, to deny the free will of man, I call this original sin. The first original sin of belief is the denial of freedom of belief. The core of the spirit of Western religious belief is creationism, or the core of the theory is creationism. God and the creator of the whole world and human destiny, then God, in the symbol of absolute truth, wants to prescribe the trajectory of human destiny, and God's will becomes an irrevocable destiny of human destiny. The human lost the freedom of the spirit, just in the shadow of God's will of a kind of existence. People even put his image as human is God's sheep grazing, then lost the right to spiritual freedom. The whole destiny of man, in fact, become God's will has already dogged the picture scroll constantly unfolding process. Human beings have completely lost the right to create their own destiny according to their own understanding of mind and freedom, and have completely lost the right to sublimate into free people. Under this belief, the will of God and the Spirit of God become a luxurious prison, a luxurious iron prison, and the prisoners on death row in the iron prison are the possibility of human spiritual freedom or the right of human spiritual freedom. Then, we all know that people need faith and God because, in the face of nihilistic fate and fear of death, people need to establish the meaning and value of their existence through ultimate comfort. God or Western religious beliefs do provide the ultimate comfort that human hearts need. However, from another perspective, we can find that God does not seem to be a merciful Savior. He wants to use the ultimate comfort in exchange for human spiritual freedom, and the loss of spiritual freedom, in fact, the loss of spiritual ownership. That is to say, God seems to exchange the ultimate comfort he provides for the ownership of people's hearts. In this sense, then, God seems more like a profiteer than a merciful savior. Of course, it is unfair to say that God is like a profiteer, because in fact, the real profiteer plot, in my opinion, is the ancient Jewish wisdom that created the theological concept of God, or the theological masters emerging from the ancient Jewish wisdom, who promised to give human beings the ultimate comfort in the name of God, and use this ultimate comfort, in exchange for the ownership of the human heart. So why is this a kind of profiteer's plot? Because the mind is the starting point and destination of the whole human history, and mastering the ownership of the human mind is equivalent to mastering the ownership of human destiny and the ownership of the wealth of the whole world. So from this point of view, the theologians who emerged from the ancient Jewish wisdom, that is indeed a group of extremely smart businessmen, smart eternal menopause, then there arises the question, as a human destiny of God's will, how to communicate to the earth. Then we examine this issue in the era of scientific rationality. Then we shall not look again at the absurdity of the monstrous divinity of the Virgin being pregnant, giving birth to a divine life that communicates the will of God, and so on. Then, if we put aside such strange gods, the basic fact is that the will of God is contained in several religious scriptures, and these religious scriptures are the will of God that the theological masters of ancient times have understood after they have been revealed. That is to say, or more thoroughly, these theological masters created the will of God. The crux of the problem is that in the ancient years, these religious classics compiled by the masters of theology should dominate the destiny of mankind in the name of sacred faith, and forever. What kind of absurd ambition is this, which denies the human self and the right to create its own human history, and regards these ancient classics, which appeared thousands of years ago, like the fate that human will can never exceed, as a tragic process of putting the human free spirit in iron cans and sinking into the North Sea? Why is it a tragic process? If people lose the right to create their own destiny, they will lose their future. Freedom is the nature of the soul, but also the soul of the gifted privilege. The loss of the spirit of freedom, the loss of free will, human beings lost the meaning and value of survival, and plants and ants with the same decay, belief in the denial of human spiritual freedom, as the price of exchange of ultimate comfort, in fact, is to people with the meaning and value of life. In exchange for the ultimate comfort. In my opinion, this kind of exchange is not equivalent. Because, for the human mind, freedom is priceless, even in the name of the ultimate comfort, cannot be exchanged for human freedom and rights. The more crucial point is that, in the name of God's will, absolute truth in the name of the sacred faith, to deny human spiritual freedom, it must be to affirm the spirit of despotism as the end result. Under spiritual tyranny, there can be no religious tolerance. Under spiritual despotism, religious believers can only show their loyalty to their beliefs by their deep-seated hatred for the so-called pagans. Therefore, the negation of spiritual freedom and the affirmation of spiritual autocracy is precisely the source of the great historical tragedy we put forward at the beginning, that is, the love and hatred between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam for thousands of years, the tragedy of religious vendetta and the tragedy of so-called jihad deduced by the three sacred beliefs. It is the denial of people's spiritual beliefs as the original sin. So today's discussion, we only want to draw a conclusion, that is, in the name of faith to deny freedom, deny people's free will. This is the original sin of the past faith, but also the first original sin. Then, how to avoid the cycle of original sin in the process of rebuilding spiritual beliefs in the contemporary era is the ideological bounden duty that philosophers and teachers must undertake.